Well, maybe to set us up here, I've been taking some time off and I've been able to build some things again
Yeah.
and play with LLMs, and it's been a lot of fun getting my hands dirty and trying to build different experiences again. And the juxtaposition between what programming was like 10 years ago, which was the last time that I was substantively writing code, versus today is just enormous. And obviously, there's a lot of that goes into that around Copilot and having Claude and ChatGPT and all of those tools to write the code for you. And there's been a lot of discussion about that and what that's going to look like going forward. But one of the more interesting things that I've found is the way that products are created is also very different. And I think programs, when you write them today, are becoming a lot less rigid and a lot more flexible and give people a lot more control over the kinds of experiences that can be created. And I started to realize this. One of the things that I have been working on is a little tool for myself that takes my email newsletters and some other content that I read on a regular basis and puts it on a database, clusters it, ranks it, summarizes it for me to tell me what I need to know on that day. And one of the things that I needed to build in the process of creating this was, clustering algorithms
Right.
that could group these things together. And I did the normal thing of using k-means and some algorithms along those lines. But the problem is every day I would change my mind about the granularity of the clusters that I wanted. And one day it's like, no, I want politics and sports and local stuff. And then the next day I was like, oh, never mind, I don't like that anymore. Like, show me just like clusters of specific news events that are happening. And every time I would do that, I have to go back in and tweak a bunch of parameters to create the kind of experience that I was looking for. And when I would talk to some of my friends that worked at these AI companies and were a lot further along of where I was in their knowledge of the space, the advice that they would always give me was to do more of the stuff on top of the LLM. And at first I was a little bit skeptical
Yeah.
because of all the obvious downsides of doing that. They're slower, they hallucinate things, they make things up. But I tried thinking about what it would look like if you take more of those systems and move those over to the LLM.
Yeah.
And if you take the clustering example, you can use k-means and you have to be very opinionated about it as an engineer and as a developer about all of the parameters and what kind of experience you're trying to create. But when you do it on the LLM, you can say, here are summaries of 100 documents. Can you cluster these according to these rules from the user? And it works pretty well.
Yeah.
And again, there are a lot of downsides to it. It is slower, it is more expensive, it does make some things up sometimes along the way. So it's not going to be the right solution for every use case for sure. But one of the things that I found is that it really unlocks a lot more control for the user and a lot more flexibility in the kinds of experiences that you can create. And the user can go in and say, I want these clustered into these topics, or I want these clustered into specific news events, or whatever else the case might be. And it allows them to make those decisions for themselves rather than the product team having to try to anticipate what the user is going to want and create that experience for them. So that has been one of the more surprising things to me as I've been on this journey, and that I'm really quite excited about. And I think it's going to unlock a lot of experiences down the road.
Yeah, I think that that is such an interesting topic because, of course, a lot of people are talking about how software development can be easier because copilots help you write the software. I think like this is actually the inversion in a very, very different way, where it's like you shouldn't be writing software at all and instead
Yeah.
using this general purpose embedded thing. And I think, like, of course, like the kind of examples that you're talking about are very squarely in ranking algorithm kind of space. So theoretically, you shouldn't be writing a K clustering algorithm ever. Maybe you create three flavors that the user can swipe between or write their own. And
Yeah.
basically, it's just like a control panel which then emits an algo, which kind of controls your feed or your UI in a pretty deep way. But it completely moves away from a lot of the algorithm being written in software versus it being written as a configuration on top of an LLM.
Abstraction that gives
Yeah.
people a lot more agency and a lot more control over what their experience should be.
And that's a different way to build products. So if
Yeah.
software was a way to build a product, now AI is a way to build a product. And it's not about better software engineering. It's just rethinking what the product should do
Yeah.
if it had like a embedded LLM in it.
Yeah.
It understands the context of your app so much more deeply that, of course, you have to still program the UI elements, but a lot of it is just emerging as the user uses it, and they can control it through these control panels slash prompts slash something
Yeah.
else, and it just does what they want it to do.
Yeah. I agree with all of that. And one thing that I would add is that they LLMs can understand intent in a way that some of the traditional systems really have a lot of trouble with. So
Yes.
if you think about a system like YouTube, YouTube has a ranking algorithm that is very good. It looks at what you've engaged with in the past and what you've searched for and a bunch of other engagement signals and uses that to try to predict what you're going to want to see now. But one of the things that you'll be able to create if you really think about this through an LLM lens is that you can create your own feeds. And sometimes I want to go to YouTube and show me the most interesting podcasts about AI from the past 24 hours, sort them by the ones that are most insightful and most informative.
Yeah.
And a traditional search system or ranking system can't do that. It can't understand some of those different factors, but an LLM can. And I'm really excited about the possibility for these systems to be able to allow users to create their own feeds. So I can create my own feed of informative AI podcasts to pick up things like the acquired podcast that you're describing, things along those lines.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to be really powerful.
Yeah, and I think maybe as we are digging into this, there is two tracks over here, right? Like one is there used to be traditional ML software and systems that we used to write, which now just become a prompt in AI, which is, hey, like I don't want to expose this to the user, but I just wanted K clustering. I think an example that we were
Yeah.
discussing the other day was find all the good comments. I think YouTube
Yep.
did so much work on making the comments better. Facebook did a lot of work on making the comment better, but those systems were very hard because the data was sparse, and just like saying what is a good comment, what is a healthy comment, what is a mean comment was super hard. So, but that's just like saying, hey, take a classifier that you used to write and don't write it anymore, and instead
Yep.
convert it into these prompts, which you as the software builder or engineering team is creating. And the other one is the more adaptive product itself, where the product becomes adaptive because the controls that the user is getting can let them create a version of the product, maybe
Yeah.
just the feeds or some aspects of it, and let the user create their own product in some sense. And I think of course those both are very powerful because of course what a traditional ML team used to do, now anybody can do by saying, hey,
Yep.
give me the comments on a post and I'll tell you which ones are great.
Yeah, it's interesting thinking about where the line on that ends because I agree. But at minimum, I think it would be really powerful if more of these platforms, I mean, if you think about like what if YouTube kind of built a marketplace where anybody could go in and create their own feed that
Yeah.
governed, the candidate selection, ranking, all of those types of things, and allowed people to put together different feeds, and they had the marketplace where you could go and
Yeah.
see here are the feeds that are available that other people have created, and you could add those. I think something like that would be really powerful in a way that reshapes the user experience and gives people a lot more control over what kind of content they're going to see.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important and interesting one because when we generally talk about algorithms, and I think how even EU has wanted to regulate some of these feed ranking algorithms, in some sense, it always used to boil down to where is the user choice, and
Yeah.
there is of course a standard algorithm which is administered by the product, and then of course there is the very low end feed, which is the follow feed, which everybody knows that they want, but it doesn't really work because it's so boring. And we could never get to a point where the user can build their own feed. And that could be the holy grail in terms of both user control, but also getting to something which is more engaging for the user. Like, if I want something more informative, if I want something more entertaining, I can tailor my feed to that. Of course, how do you do that in a interface, and how can users control it easily is interesting. So maybe I think like how to get the users to describe the algo they want
Yeah.
is a hard problem.
Yeah. And it's not going to be something, I mean, you're right that these systems are very, very complicated systems. And even with this additional layer of abstraction that gives more people the ability to work with these different systems, they're still very complex and powerful systems. And most people are not going to want to spend the time to do this, nor have the expertise in how to do this. And that's why I think some of these
The
marketplace
marketplace,
kinds
yeah,
of concepts are going to be right, where a smaller number of
absolutely.
power users who do want to spend the time can create these new kinds of experiences, and then people can decide which one
Yeah,
they
yeah,
want
absolutely. I think like you're
to
right
use.
that that is the solution. Yeah, it's not like every end user can do this, but I think like now there is a template which you can just borrow and just
Yeah,
start using, and then the marketplace concept is exactly correct. And then
yeah,
maybe you could have marketplace participants who you trust, right? Yeah, you want a little
yeah.
bit more conservative voice, let's have a conservative feed. And if you want a little bit more entertaining feed, let's have that.
Yeah, and I think that that decentralization would be great for people
Yeah.
ultimately to be able to make and be empowered to make more of those decisions for themselves.
Yeah, I think the other aspect of that is like maybe how do we dig further into, okay, if this becomes such a pervasive kind of a paradigm, what what should product managers, product builders do to make their products more ready to do this? Because I do think this is a little bit of a change. I think this is a change in terms of like you design the product, you design it to the nth degree, including the
Yeah,
algorithms, and then you expose it, versus a world where things are slightly more evolving. And what you've created is the harness, and maybe you've created the language and the database and stuff,
yeah,
but then you're letting the user tailor things, or marketplace tailor the things, and then of course the user is adopting the flavors of your app, but more emergent behaviors, right? So how
yeah.
should somebody think about designing from this as a first principle versus, I think we are so embedded in how we think that I think it sometimes feels hard to conceive what should an amazing adaptive product look like.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the thought experiment is if you take big chunks of the application and move more of them to be done on top of an LLM, what would that look like? And that's not always going to be the right trade-off because I mentioned this before, but they are slower. They do make things up. They are harder to debug, and there are a lot of good reasons why you shouldn't go with those. And if you're working on something like a payment processing system, that's not always that's not the right set of trade-offs that you should be making in that context, of course. But I would be encouraging all product managers to think about, if we took a lot of these core ranking systems, clustering, other aspects of algorithms, and move that over to an LLM,
Yeah.
what kind of flexibility would we gain, and what kinds of things could users do with that flexibility? Because I think that's really where it comes down to. There are a bunch of trade-offs and a bunch of costs of doing more of the stuff on top of the LLMs, but how much upside is there, and how many new kinds of things could be unlocked if we were to go in that direction? And that's the thought experiment that I would be running if I were in a lot of these shoes in there.
Yeah, I think like one other thing here, even in really large setups, like large companies, I think ranking was the last thing that you did after you've reached scale. Now, I think on day zero, you can have good ranking. So there is no excuse. So I think like,
Yeah,
if you were creating YouTube in 2012, you will not be talking about, hey, how will the ranking work? You will be like, let me just get more videos. Once I know enough videos, enough clicks, I will. It depended on data so much that first app version was always dumb and the second app version was smarter. I think that became a moat in some sense for the large apps, because to get really good user experience, you needed great ranking. To get great ranking, you needed a lot of data. I think that is also getting disrupted, and I feel like people maybe need to internalize that, which is on day zero, you can have a single shot ranking, which is great. You can
yeah,
give it some flavor, which is what you believe your app is. So let's say if this app is about conversations and videos, then I
yeah,
could say do ranking where interesting conversations are shown first. And I don't need to know what interesting means based on clicks.
yeah. Yeah, that's totally right. And I think one of the big advantages that you have now is that you have, infinite different classifiers that
Use on
you
day
can play
zero.
with.
Yeah.
Yeah, on day zero. And you can be opinionated about that in your product. But again, I think one of the really powerful things is you don't have to be opinionated. I mean, you should be, that's just good general practice in the product to be opinionated about what this thing is for. But I think the real power of these things is that they give people more choice in what that should look like. And how do you bake that in as a core aspect of the product as well? Well, I think we covered a lot of ground.